Welcome to Big Breaking News of America. Genesis Episode 12. The Flood Narrative, Genesis 6:9. The flood narrative in Genesis 6:9 is a cornerstone of the primeval history in Genesis 1:11, presenting a dramatic account of divine judgment and mercy in response to humanity's escalating wickedness. This sweeping story describes God's decision to send a deluge to destroy corrupt humanity and creation, Noah's selection as a righteous remnant to build an ark, the survival of Noah's family and representative animals, and the subsequent renewal of the world through a covenant. Beginning with the grim observation that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, Genesis 6:5. The narrative unfolds as a theological and literary masterpiece, balancing themes of justice and grace, destruction and restoration, and human failure and divine faithfulness. It serves as a climactic moment in the primeval history, bridging the genealogies and cultural developments, Genesis 5:10, with the dispersion at Babel, Genesis 11:1-9. While setting the stage for the covenantal narrative of Abraham, Genesis 12. Rooted in ancient Near Eastern flood traditions and shaped by the exilic context, Genesis 6:9 carries profound theological weight, influencing Jewish theology, ethics, and global cultural narratives. This exploration examines the narrative's literary structure, theological significance, historical and cultural context, interpretive traditions, and modern relevance, highlighting its role as a pivotal text in the Torah's foundational story. 1. Overview and structure of the narrative. Genesis 6:9 is a carefully structured narrative that unfolds in a symmetrical, almost chiastic pattern, emphasizing the cycle of creation, destruction, and recreation. Spanning 4 chapters, it combines vivid storytelling, repetitive motifs, and theological reflection to convey the story of the flood and its aftermath. Key events: human wickedness and divine resolve. Genesis 6:1-13. The narrative opens with humanity's growing population and mysterious intermarriages between the sons of God and daughters of men, Genesis 6:1-4, contributing to widespread corruption. God observes that every intention of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually, Genesis 6:5. Limiting human lifespan to 120 years and resolving to blot out humanity, animals, and creation, Genesis 6:7. Noah, however, finds favor as a righteous man, blameless in his generation, Genesis 6:9. Noah's commission and the ark. Genesis 6:14-22. God instructs Noah to build an ark of gopher wood, specifying its dimensions and design, Genesis 6:14-16. Noah is to take his family and representatives of every animal aboard to survive the flood, which will destroy all flesh, Genesis 6:17-20. Noah obeys all that God commanded, Genesis 6:22. The flood and destruction. Genesis 7:1-24. God commands Noah to enter the ark with his family and animals, specifying 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean, Genesis 7:1-5. The flood begins with rain for 40 days and nights, and waters from the fountains of the great deep and windows of the heavens, Genesis 7:11-12, submerging the earth and destroying all life outside the ark, Genesis 7:17-24. Noah, his family, and the animals survive. Receding waters and renewal. Genesis 8:1-19. God remembers Noah, sending a wind to dry the earth, Genesis 8:1. The waters recede over months, with the ark resting on the mountains of Ararat. Genesis 8:4. Noah sends out a raven and a dove to test the land's dryness, with the dove's return with an olive leaf signaling hope. Genesis 8:6-12. When the earth is dry, God commands Noah to leave the ark, and the survivors disembark. Genesis 8:13-19. Covenant and new creation. Genesis 8:29-17. Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifices, pleasing God, who vows never again to curse the ground or destroy all life despite humanity's evil inclination. Genesis 8:20-22. God blesses Noah and his sons, renewing the mandate to be fruitful and multiply. Genesis 9:1. Granting meat as food with a prohibition against consuming blood, and establishing the sanctity of human life. Genesis 9:26. God makes a covenant with Noah, his descendants, and all creation, promising no further flood, with the rainbow as its sign. Genesis 9:8-17. Noah's drunkenness and aftermath. Genesis 9:18-29. The narrative concludes with Noah's drunkenness and nakedness, Ham's disrespectful act, and the cursing of Canaan, Ham's son, alongside blessings for Shem and Japheth. Genesis 9:20-27. Noah dies at 950 years, and his sons' descendants are noted. Genesis 9:28-29. Structural features. The narrative is structured chiastically, with creation's corruption, Genesis 6, mirrored by its renewal, Genesis 8-9, and the flood's rise, Genesis 7, paralleled by its recession, Genesis 8. The central pivot is God's remembrance of Noah, Genesis 8:1, emphasizing divine mercy. The Toledo formula, these are the generations of Noah. Genesis 6:9, introduces the narrative, linking it to the genealogies, Genesis 5:10, and marking a transition in the primeval history. Repetitive motifs, all flesh according to their kinds as God commanded, create a liturgical rhythm, reinforcing divine sovereignty and Noah's obedience. Literary style. The narrative blends prose and poetic elements, with vivid imagery, for example, fountains of the great deep Genesis 7:11, the dove's olive leaf, Genesis 8:11, and concise dialogue, for example, God's commands, Genesis 6:14-21. The style is mythic yet grounded, conveying theological truths through archetypal symbols. Wordplay, such as Noach, Noah, meaning rest or comfort, Genesis 5:29, and the rainbow, Keshet, also bow, Genesis 9:13, adds linguistic depth, linking Noah's role to creation's restoration. Ambiguities, E.G., the sons of God, Genesis 6:2, Ham's act, Genesis 9:22, the rainbow's significance, invite interpretation, a hallmark of Genesis's style that fuels rabbinic and philosophical reflection. Two theological themes and significance. Genesis 6:9 is a theological masterpiece, weaving themes of divine judgment and mercy, human righteousness, covenant, and creation's restoration. It builds on the spread of sin, Genesis 4:5, to depict God's response to moral corruption, while setting the stage for the covenantal narrative, Genesis 12. Divine judgment and justice. The flood is a response to humanity's pervasive wickedness, where every intention of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually, Genesis 6:5. God's decision to blot out creation, Genesis 6:7, reflects divine justice, addressing sin's cosmic disruption, a theme rooted in the fall, Genesis 3, and Cain's murder, Genesis 4. The destruction of all flesh, Genesis 7:21, underscores the severity of sin's consequences, aligning with the Torah's moral causality. For example, Leviticus 26:14-39. Cultural impact. The theme of divine judgment shapes Jewish theology of accountability, seen in Yom Kippur's focus on repentance, and influences global religious narratives of justice, from apocalyptic literature to ethical teachings. Divine mercy and grace. Noah's selection as a righteous man, Genesis 6:9, and God's remembrance, Genesis 8:1, highlight divine mercy, preserving a remnant despite judgment. God's vow never to destroy creation again, Genesis 8:21-22, and the covenant with the rainbow, Genesis 9:8-17, affirm enduring grace. The balance of justice and mercy is a hallmark of Genesis's theology, seen in Cain's mark, Genesis 4:15, and later covenants, for example, Genesis 15:18. Cultural impact. Divine mercy informs Jewish practices like teshuvah, repentance, and chaste, loving kindness, and resonates in global religious and secular narratives of forgiveness and hope, from liturgy to restorative justice. Human righteousness and obedience. Noah's righteousness and obedience, he did all that God commanded, Genesis 6:22-7-5, make him a model of faithfulness, contrasting with humanity's corruption. His role as a remnant foreshadows Abraham's covenantal obedience, Genesis 12:1-3. Noah's drunkenness, Genesis 9:20-21, however, reveals human frailty, linking him to Adam's fall, Genesis 3, and signaling sin's persistence post-flood. Cultural impact. Noah's righteousness inspires Jewish ethics of tzaddik, righteous person, and global moral exemplars, while his frailty informs reflections on human imperfection, from Musar literature to psychological studies. Covenant and divine faithfulness. The Noahide covenant, Genesis 9:8-17, with the rainbow as its sign, is the Torah's first explicit covenant, promising preservation of creation despite human evil, Genesis 8:21. It is universal, encompassing all humanity and creatures, setting the stage for particular covenants, for example, Abraham, Genesis 12. The covenant establishes ethical norms, such as the sanctity of life, Genesis 9:5-6, and the prohibition against consuming blood, Genesis 9:4, later expanded in Jewish law, for example, Leviticus 17:11. Cultural impact. The covenant shapes Jewish theology of divine faithfulness, seen in Brit, covenant, rituals like circumcision, and influences global religious and ethical frameworks, from environmental stewardship to human rights. Creation's restoration and continuity. The flood narrative mirrors Genesis 1, with the waters recalling the primordial chaos, Genesis 1:2, and the receding waters echoing creation's order, Genesis 8:1-5. The mandate to be fruitful and multiply, Genesis 9:1, renews Genesis 1:28, affirming creation's goodness despite sin. The olive leaf, Genesis 8:11, and rainbow, Genesis 9:13, symbolize hope and renewal, linking the flood to Jewish and global motifs of restoration. Cultural impact. The restoration theme inspires Jewish practices like Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, and global environmental movements, emphasizing creation's enduring value. Sanctity of life and ethical norms. The prohibition against murder and the declaration that whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, Genesis 9:6, establish the sanctity of human life, rooted in the image of God, Genesis 1:26-27. This principle underpins Jewish law, for example, Pikuach Nefesh, and global ethics. The dietary laws, Genesis 9:3-4, reflect a post-flood concession to human weakness, balanced by reverence for life, a precursor to kosher laws, Leviticus 11. Cultural impact. The sanctity of life informs Jewish advocacy for peace and justice, and shapes global human rights, influencing policies against violence and exploitation. 3. Literary artistry and style. The literary artistry of Genesis 6:9 enhances its theological impact, making it a compelling and emotionally resonant narrative. Its vivid imagery, symmetrical structure, and stylistic features reflect its oral tradition roots and engagement with ancient literary conventions. Symmetrical and chiastic structure. The narrative's chiastic structure, corruption, Genesis 6, flood, Genesis 7, recession, Genesis 8, renewal, Genesis 9, creates a sense of balance, with God's remembrance, Genesis 8:1, as the pivot. This mirrors creation's order-chaos-order cycle, Genesis 1:3. Repetitive phrases, all flesh as God commanded according to their kinds, create a liturgical rhythm, reinforcing divine sovereignty and Noah's obedience, suited for oral recitation. Cultural impact. The symmetrical structure ensures memorability, making the narrative a staple in Jewish liturgy and global storytelling, from synagogue readings to epic retellings. Vivid imagery and symbolism. The narrative's imagery is evocative. The fountains of the great deep and windows of the heavens, Genesis 7:11, depict cosmic upheaval, while the ark, olive leaf, Genesis 8:11, and rainbow, Genesis 9:13, symbolize salvation, hope, and covenant. These images resonate in Jewish and global iconography. The ark, a microcosm of creation, and the flood's waters recall Genesis 1's chaos, linking the narrative to creation theology. The rainbow, keshet, also bow, symbolizes peace, possibly evoking a warrior's bow set aside. Cultural impact. The imagery inspires artistic and literary retellings, from medieval Noah's Ark illustrations to modern films, for example, Noah, 2014, and shapes theological reflections on judgment and grace. Dialogue and narrative tension. Concise dialogue, God's commands to Noah, Genesis 6:14-21, 7:15, and Noah's silence, heightens tension, emphasizing obedience amid crisis. The absence of human voices during the flood, Genesis 7, underscores destruction's severity, contrasted by God's covenantal speech, Genesis 9:8-17. The narrative's pacing, with detailed preparations, Genesis 6:7, and gradual recession, Genesis 8, builds suspense, culminating in hope and renewal, Genesis 9. Cultural impact. The dialogue and tension engage audiences, fostering discussion in Jewish Chevruta and global literature, from moral allegories to psychological analyses. Ambiguity and interpretive openness. Ambiguities, such as the sons of God, Genesis 6:2, the nature of Noah's righteousness, Genesis 6:9, Ham's act, Genesis 9:22, and the rainbow's significance, invite interpretation, fueling rabbinic exegesis and philosophical reflection. The mythic quality, blending historical memory and theological truth, makes the narrative universal, addressing timeless questions of justice, survival, and renewal. Cultural impact. The ambiguity fosters ongoing engagement, seen in Jewish midrash and global discussions of theology, ethics, and anthropology. 4. Historical and cultural context. The flood narrative must be understood within its historical and cultural context, as it emerged in a world of ancient Near Eastern flood myths and was likely shaped by the needs of ancient Israel, particularly during or after the Babylonian exile. Its engagement with neighboring traditions and exilic resonance reflect its purpose as a theological and cultural statement. Ancient Near Eastern parallels. The flood narrative shares striking parallels with Mesopotamian flood myths, notably the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, and the Atrahasis. In these, gods send a flood to curb human overpopulation or noise, with a survivor, for example, Utnapishtim, building a boat, saving animals, and offering sacrifices. Genesis 6:9 adapts these motifs but emphasizes monotheistic theology, moral judgment, and covenant. The ark's dimensions, Genesis 6:15, and the sending of birds, Genesis 8:6-12, echo Mesopotamian accounts, but Genesis's focus on Noah's righteousness and the universal covenant distinguishes it, countering polytheistic chaos with divine order. The rainbow, Genesis 9:13, may parallel Mesopotamian celestial signs, but its role as a covenantal symbol is unique, reflecting Israel's theology of divine faithfulness. Cultural significance. By engaging familiar flood motifs, Genesis 6:9 made its theology accessible to an audience steeped in ancient Near Eastern culture, while its monotheistic focus distinguished Israel's faith, shaping its identity in a polytheistic world. Babylonian exile and priestly /Yahwist context. Scholars attribute Genesis 6:9 to a blend of priestly, p, and Yahwist, j, sources, with p's orderly style, for example, Genesis 6:9-22, 9:1-17, and j's narrative vividness, for example, Genesis 7:1-5, 9:20-27. Likely finalized during or after the Babylonian exile, 587-539 BCE, the narrative addressed exilic concerns of judgment, survival, and restoration. The flood's destruction and renewal mirrored Israel's exile and hope for return, with Noah's remnant paralleling the exilic community, for example, Isaiah 54:9-10. The Universal Covenant countered Babylonian claims of divine supremacy, affirming Israel's God as creator and sustainer. Noah's drunkenness and Canaan's curse, Genesis 9:20-27, may reflect exilic tensions with neighboring peoples, for example, Canaanites, reinforcing Israel's distinct identity. Cultural significance. The exilic shaping made Genesis 6:9 a text of resilience, unifying Jews through a shared story of divine judgment and mercy, critical in diaspora. Oral tradition roots. The narrative's repetitive motifs, vivid imagery, and symmetrical structure suggest origins in oral tradition, likely recited in tribal or cultic settings to preserve history and theology. The flood's archetypal imagery, for example, ark, rainbow, aided memorization, ensuring transmission. The transition to written form, possibly during the monarchic, c. 1587 BCE, or exilic period, preserved the narrative for communal study and worship, aligning with scribal practices in ancient Israel. Cultural impact. The oral-to-written development made Genesis 6:9 adaptable, from ancient storytelling to synagogue readings, partiio, ensuring its endurance in Jewish culture. Socio-political dynamics. The narrative's assertion of divine sovereignty over creation challenged Babylonian cosmologies, for example, Marduk's victory in Enuma Elish, positioning Israel's God as supreme. The Universal Covenant supported Israel's identity as a light to the nations, Isaiah 42:6, critical during political upheaval. The sanctity of life, Genesis 9:5-6, and ethical norms countered ancient Near Eastern violence, reflecting Israel's call to ethical living, for example, Leviticus 19:18. Cultural impact. These dynamics shaped Jewish theology and ethics, influencing the Torah's laws and prophetic calls for justice, and resonating in modern discussions of global ethics and environmental care. 5 Rabbinic and mystical interpretations. The richness of Genesis 6:9 has inspired extensive Jewish interpretive traditions, from rabbinic exegesis to mystical theology, deepening its theological and cultural significance and ensuring its relevance across generations. Rabbinic exegesis. Bereshit Rabbah, c. 5th century CE, interprets the flood as divine justice for humanity's moral failure, with Noah's righteousness, Genesis 6:9, as a model of tzedek. The Midrash debates Noah's merit, suggesting he was blameless in his generation but less righteous than Abraham, Genesis Rabbah 30:9. The sons of God, Genesis 6:2, are often seen as fallen angels or noblemen, with their sin reflecting pride, a warning against corruption. The rainbow, Genesis 9:13, is a sign of divine patience, urging teshuvah, repentance. The Talmud, Sanhedrin 108a, praises Noah's obedience but critiques his silence, contrasting him with Moses' intercession, while the sanctity of life, Genesis 9:6, underpins ethical laws, Pikuach Nefesh. Cultural impact. Rabbinic interpretations shape Jewish liturgy, for example, prayers citing the covenant, education, for example, Torah study of Noach, and ethics, for example, chaste, making the narrative a living text in communal life. Mystical perspectives. The Zohar, 13th century, views the flood as a cosmic purification, with the waters cleansing the Sitra Achra, other side. The ark represents the Shekinah, divine presence, protecting the righteous, while Noah symbolizes the Sfra of Yesod, foundation, linking heaven and earth. The rainbow is a mystical sign of divine unity, reflecting the Sephiroth's harmony, and the covenant, Genesis 9:8-17, is a spiritual bond, renewed through Torah study. Noah's drunkenness, Genesis 9:20-21, is seen as a failed attempt to restore Eden's purity. Cultural impact. Mystical readings enrich Jewish spirituality, influencing prayer, for example, meditations on renewal, meditation, and festivals, appealing to those seeking deeper meaning in Genesis 6:9. Ethical and communal applications. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations inspire Jewish ethics, with the flood narrative cited in Musar literature to promote righteousness, repentance, and communal responsibility. The covenant's universality underpins advocacy for peace and justice. The narrative's focus on restoration encourages tikkun olam, seen in Jewish environmental and social initiatives, while Noah's obedience inspires communal leadership. Cultural impact. These interpretations ensure Genesis 6:9's role in Jewish communal life, from ethical teachings to social justice initiatives, reinforcing its cultural vitality. 6. Engagement with ancient Near Eastern traditions. The flood narrative's dialogue with ancient Near Eastern traditions is a critical aspect of its historical and cultural context, as it adapts and transforms familiar motifs to assert a monotheistic theology. Mesopotamian context. The Epic of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis feature flood survivors, Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, who build boats, save animals, and offer sacrifices, paralleling Noah's actions. Genesis 6:9 reworks these to emphasize moral judgment, Noah's righteousness, and a universal covenant, contrasting with polytheistic caprice. The fountains of the great deep, Genesis 7:11, echo Mesopotamian cosmic waters, for example, Tiamat, but Genesis subordinates them to God's will, demythologizing chaos. Cultural significance. By engaging Mesopotamian flood myths, Genesis 6:9 made its theology accessible while asserting Israel's distinct faith, particularly relevant in the exilic context of Babylonian influence. Egyptian parallels. Egyptian myths, such as the destruction of humanity by Atha, feature divine judgment, but lack a covenantal renewal. Genesis 6:9's focus on ethical norms and divine faithfulness distinguishes it, reflecting Israel's unique theology. The rainbow, Genesis 9:13, may echo Egyptian celestial symbols, but its covenantal role is innovative, emphasizing God's commitment to creation. Cultural significance. These parallels ground Genesis 6:9 in a familiar cultural milieu, making its theology relatable while asserting Israel's worldview. Canaanite influences. Canaanite myths, such as Baal's battles with chaotic waters, for example, Yam, parallel the flood's cosmic upheaval, but Genesis portrays God as supreme, with no divine rivals. The Ark's preservation of life reflects Israel's theology of creation's value, contrasting with Canaanite violence. The curse on Canaan, Genesis 9:25, may engage regional tensions, affirming Israel's distinct identity. Cultural significance. The engagement with Canaanite motifs positioned Genesis 6:9 as a theological counterpoint, reinforcing Israel's monotheistic identity in its regional context. Theological innovation. Genesis 6:9's monotheism, moral focus, and universal covenant distinguish it from ancient Near Eastern myths, offering a vision of humanity as accountable to one God, with a promise of preservation. This innovation shapes the Torah's narrative and theology. Cultural impact. This innovation influenced Western religious and ethical traditions, from the Torah's laws to global environmental and human rights frameworks, ensuring Genesis 6:9's enduring legacy. 7. Enduring relevance and modern applications. Genesis 6:9 remains a living text, its themes and lessons resonating in Jewish practice, interfaith dialogue, and contemporary issues. Its adaptability ensures its significance in addressing modern challenges while rooted in ancient wisdom. Jewish practice and identity. The narrative is central to Jewish liturgy and study, with Parsha Noach, Genesis 6:9-11:32, engaging communities through synagogue readings and discussion. The Noahide covenant informs Brit rituals and prayers, emphasizing divine faithfulness. The sanctity of life, Genesis 9:5-6, shapes Jewish ethics, seen in pikuach nefesh and advocacy for peace, while the restoration theme inspires tikkun olam, reflected in environmental and social initiatives. Noah's righteousness and the flood's renewal resonate in Jewish history, from exilic hope to modern resilience, seen in prayers for redemption. Interfaith and universal resonance. In Christianity, Genesis 6:9 shapes reflections on judgment, grace, and covenant, with the flood as a type of baptism, 1 Peter 3:20-21, and the rainbow as a sign of hope. The narrative informs theology, liturgy, and ethics, promoting global unity. In Islam, the Quran's account of Noah, for example, Surah 11:25-49, echoes Genesis 6:9, emphasizing righteousness and divine mercy, fostering shared Abrahamic values. Interfaith initiatives draw on the narrative to address issues like environmental care and peace building. The universal themes, judgment, mercy, renewal, provide common ground for ethical discussions, from global cooperation to human dignity, in interfaith and secular contexts. Contemporary issues. Environmental stewardship, the flood's ecological impact and the covenant's inclusion of all creation, Genesis 9:10, inspire Jewish and global environmental movements, with organizations like Hazan citing Genesis 6:9 to advocate for climate action and sustainability. Ethics and justice, the sanctity of life and ethical norms, Genesis 9:4-6, inform discussions of human rights, addressing issues like violence, capital punishment, and social justice, with Jewish thinkers promoting peace and accountability. Crisis and resilience, the flood's narrative of destruction and renewal resonates in discussions of crisis response, from natural disasters to pandemics, with Noah's obedience offering a model for leadership and hope. Cultural identity and diversity, the universal covenant and post-flood humanity inform multiculturalism, promoting unity amid diversity in pluralistic societies. Cultural and educational role. Genesis 6:9 inspires literature, for example, Byron's Heaven and Earth, art, for example, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel flood scenes, and media, for example, Evan Almighty, shaping cultural narratives of survival and renewal. Its archetypal imagery, ark, flood, rainbow, resonates in storytelling across genres. In education, Genesis 6:9 is studied in Jewish day schools, yeshivas, and universities, fostering discussions of theology, ethics, and anthropology. Its accessibility engages diverse audiences, from children learning about Noah's Ark to scholars analyzing its structure. 8. Broader cultural and religious impact. The flood narrative's impact extends beyond Judaism, shaping religious traditions, cultural narratives, and ethical thought worldwide. Jewish tradition. Genesis 6:9 is foundational to Jewish theology, liturgy, and ethics, influencing practices like Teshuvah, Pikuach Nefesh, and Tikkun Olam. Its narratives are retold in synagogue readings, education, and festivals, ensuring its vitality in communal life. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations deepen its significance, from Bereshit Rabbah's ethical insights to the Zohar's spiritual vision, enriching Jewish thought and practice. Interfaith influence. In Christianity, Genesis 6:9 shapes reflections on judgment, grace, and covenant, influencing theology, liturgy, and ethics. Its narratives impact Western religious culture, seen in art, literature, and missions. In Islam, the Quran's Nuh story reflects Genesis 6:9's themes, fostering shared Abrahamic values. Interfaith initiatives draw on the narrative to address ethical and social issues, from environmental care to justice. Global culture. Genesis 6:9's themes inspire literature, art, and media, from ancient flood myths to modern films, shaping cultural narratives of crisis and hope. Its archetypal imagery ensures its presence in storytelling, from myths to histories. Its ethical contributions, particularly the sanctity of life and environmental stewardship, inform global human rights, ecological policies, and philosophical debates, reflecting its enduring legacy. 9. Synthesis. Genesis 6:9 as a theological and narrative climax. Genesis 6:9, the flood narrative, is a theological and narrative climax in the primeval history, depicting divine judgment and mercy in response to human wickedness, while affirming righteousness, covenant, and creation's restoration. Its literary artistry, symmetrical structure, vivid imagery, and interpretive openness, enhances its emotional and theological impact, making it a timeless story of crisis and renewal. Rooted in the ancient Near Eastern milieu, it engages Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Canaanite flood traditions to assert a monotheistic vision of moral accountability and divine faithfulness, shaped by the exilic context to inspire hope and identity. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations deepen its meaning, ensuring its vitality in Jewish tradition, while its universal themes resonate in interfaith and secular contexts. In modern times, Genesis 6:9 addresses issues like environmental stewardship, ethics, resilience, and diversity, affirming its relevance as a source of wisdom and inspiration. As a pivotal text in the primeval history, it prepares for the Torah's covenantal narrative, offering a vision of humanity's survival and God's enduring commitment. Thank you for watching Big Breaking News of America. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for more news updates. Share our channel with your friends and family members. Leave a like for more videos and express your thoughts under comment section.